The Hells Angels biker heard the little girl beg, "Don't let him take me," and his justice hit faster than thunder. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. On a cold, moonless night, a rumble broke the silence of the quiet streets. Jake Morrison, known to many as Razor, the Hells Angels biker, cruised down the empty road, his motorcycle's engine roaring like a lion on the hunt. His leather jacket, adorned with the familiar Hells Angels patch, caught the faint glow of the streetlights as he sped through the still night. Razor was used to long, lonely rides, but something felt different this time, like the air itself was charged with tension. As he rounded the corner of an old, run-down street, a faint sound reached his ears. It was almost too soft at first, but then it became clearer, a voice, trembling, desperate. "Don't let him take me." Razor's instincts kicked in before he could even process what he'd just heard. He pulled on the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement as he came to an abrupt stop. His eyes scanned the dark alley, searching for the source of the voice. And there, in the dim light, he saw her, a young girl, no older than 10, crouching against a cold brick wall, her hands clasped together in fear. A tall man stood in front of her, his rough figure looming over her. The scene was straight out of Razor's nightmares. Another helpless victim, another opportunity to right the wrongs of the world. The girl's wide, terrified eyes locked onto Razor's, and she trembled harder. The man, unaware of Razor's presence, growled in frustration, taking a step closer to the girl. "You're coming with me," he snarled. Razor didn't think twice. He slammed his foot on the ground, dismounted his bike, and stepped into the alley, his heavy boots making the air even more tense with every step. The man turned toward Razor, his expression one of annoyance at being interrupted. "This is none of your business, biker," the man sneered, his hand hovering near a knife at his belt. Razor's cold gaze never left the man as he took a step closer, his voice low but full of authority. "It is now." The man chuckled darkly, clearly underestimating the biker. "You're going to regret this," he spat, drawing the knife. But Razor was faster. With a swift motion, he lunged forward, knocking the man to the ground with a powerful strike. The knife clattered to the pavement as Razor pinned him with one hand. "You're not taking her anywhere," Razor growled, his grip tightening. The man struggled, but Razor's strength was unmatched. Razor's eyes flicked over to the girl, who was now staring at him with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He could see the fear still lingering in her eyes, but there was also a flicker of hope. Razor released the man, who quickly scrambled to his feet and staggered away, knowing he was no match for the biker. "Get out of here before I change my mind," Razor warned, his voice cold and unforgiving. The man didn't hesitate. He turned and fled into the night, leaving the girl behind. Razor turned back to the girl, his expression softening just a fraction. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. She nodded, her lips trembling, but she didn't speak. Razor took a step closer, crouching down to her level. "You're safe now," he said, his voice calm. The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. I didn't think you would help me," she whispered. Razor's heart tightened. He'd seen enough in his life to know that people like her rarely had anyone to turn to. "I'm here now," he said simply. "You're not alone." The girl sat quietly on the edge of the bench in Razor's garage, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she watched the mechanic work. The harsh lights above cast long shadows across the space, illuminating the workbench where various bike parts were strewn around like puzzle pieces waiting to be assembled. Razor, his sleeves rolled up to reveal his tattoos, was focused on tightening bolts and adjusting the chain on the Harley-Davidson. It had been a long night, but the adrenaline from the previous events was still simmering in his veins. He had acted without thinking when he intervened earlier, but the girl's trust in him, her wide, frightened eyes, lingered in his mind. "What's your name?" he asked, not looking up from his work as the sound of the wrench turning echoed in the room. She hesitated for a moment before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lily," she said. Razor paused, his hand frozen on the wrench for a split second as the name struck him like a memory long forgotten. Lily. He hadn't heard that name in years, but it made his heart tighten. He had once known a girl named Lily, a girl whose face he could still picture in his mind. She had been his daughter. The memory hit him like a wave, but he quickly pushed it aside. The girl in front of him wasn't his daughter, and the past wasn't something he could afford to dwell on. He cleared his throat and turned back to his work, trying to focus on the task at hand. Lily, he said again, testing the name on his tongue. It felt strange, like a wound that had only just begun to heal. He focused on the bike, trying to keep his hands steady, but his mind wandered. He had lost everything once, his family, his purpose, his sense of self. Now, here he was, fixing a bike for a girl who had just been saved from God knows what. Lily was sitting there, so small and fragile, yet her eyes held a fire he hadn't expected. He caught her glancing around the garage, her gaze lingering on a stack of motorcycle magazines and old photos that lined the walls. Razor had built this place with his own hands, but it didn't feel like home anymore. It was just a place to keep him from the world, a place where no one could touch him. But Lily had. Without warning, she broke the silence. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice soft, but full of curiosity. Razor turned to face her, wiping his hands on a rag before leaning against the workbench. He studied her for a moment, her innocent eyes wide with a mix of gratitude and confusion. She was looking at him as if he were some kind of hero, but Razor didn't see himself that way. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, Lily," he said slowly. "But there's one thing I know. I can't just stand by and watch someone suffer. Not again." He ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of his words. "You're lucky I heard you. If I hadn't, who knows what would have happened to you?" She nodded slowly, her eyes dropping to the floor as if she were processing his words. "I was scared," she said quietly. "I thought no one would come. But you did." Razor's throat tightened as he looked at her. The rawness in her voice reminded him of the fear he'd seen in his own daughter's eyes before it was too late. He could still remember the moment he couldn't save her. It had haunted him every day since. He shook his head to clear the thoughts, forcing himself to focus. "You don't need to be scared anymore," Razor said, his voice firm. "You're safe here." There was a long pause as Lily studied him, her gaze softening. "Thank you," she whispered. Razor didn't know what to say. Words didn't come easily to him. He wasn't used to this, protecting someone, caring for them. He was used to the road, the club, and the rough life that came with it. But in this moment, standing in the middle of his dimly lit garage, it felt like something had shifted. He wasn't just a biker anymore. He was a protector. And for the first time in a long while, it felt right. Just then, the distant sound of a motorcycle engine revved outside. Razor's attention snapped to the door, his instincts kicking in. His hand automatically went to the knife at his side, but he quickly relaxed when he recognized the rumble of his own club's bikes. A moment later, the door opened, and two of his brothers walked in. "Everything good?" one of them, Steele, asked, his gruff voice cutting through the quiet. Razor nodded, his eyes flicking back to Lily, who had stood up from the bench. "Yeah," Razor replied. "We're good. Just taking care of business." Steele raised an eyebrow, eyeing Lily but saying nothing. The other brother, Viper, glanced at Razor before looking back at Lily. "She all right?" he asked. Razor gave him a sharp nod. "She's fine. Just had a rough night." Viper gave a low whistle, his gaze lingering on Lily for a moment longer before he looked away. "All right. Then, we'll leave you to it." As they turned to leave, Razor's thoughts were still on the girl. She was safe now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that her arrival in his life wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't just about saving her from one bad night. It felt like something much bigger was at play, and Razor had a feeling he wasn't done protecting her yet. The days following the night in the garage were a blur of cautious normalcy. Razor found himself more aware of every small detail, more protective of the young girl who had come into his life unexpectedly. Lily had been quiet, withdrawn even, but there was a spark in her eyes every time she looked at him, a kind of silent gratitude he couldn't ignore. Razor was used to the rough edges of life, used to people who needed saving, but this time felt different. The more he looked at Lily, the more he realized how deeply her presence affected him. He had promised her safety, and for some reason, that promise felt more binding than any oath he'd ever sworn to his club. One afternoon, Razor was bent over his bike, fixing a stubborn part that had been bothering him for weeks. The garage was empty, quiet, except for the hum of the lights and the sound of his tools. Then he heard it, the faint click of the door opening. Looking up, he saw Lily standing there, watching him with her head tilted, as if she was trying to figure him out. Razor paused, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's on your mind, kid?" he asked, his voice gruff but soft. Lily hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer, her small voice breaking the silence. "Can I help?" Razor raised an eyebrow. "Help with what?" Lily pointed at the engine he was working on. "I used to help my dad with the car," she explained, her tone hesitant but eager. "I know a few things." Razor studied her for a moment, the determination in her eyes reminding him of the girl he'd failed to protect so long ago. He nodded slowly. "All right, show me what you've got." Lily's face lit up as she stepped closer, cautiously but with growing confidence. Razor handed her the wrench, watching as she adjusted herself in front of the bike. Her small hands were surprisingly steady as she took over the task Razor had been struggling with. He stood back, crossing his arms, and watched her work. It wasn't just that she had knowledge. There was a quiet strength to the way she moved, a resolve that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. "You've got the touch, kid," Razor said after a while, surprised at how quickly she fixed the issue. Lily looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Really?" Razor chuckled softly. "Yeah, you've got skills." She smiled, but the smile was fleeting. Razor couldn't ignore the sadness in her eyes, the subtle weight of her past. It was clear that this little girl had seen more than any child should. And yet, there she was, showing him that she still had hope. "You've been through a lot," Razor said, his voice quiet, careful not to push her too far. "You can talk about it, if you want." Lily shook her head, her expression darkening. "No, it's okay," she said quickly. "I don't want to talk about it." Razor nodded, understanding more than she knew. He wasn't one to talk about his past either. But there was something about Lily that made him want to protect her, keep her safe from the darkness he had known. They worked in silence for a while, the sounds of the garage filling the space between them. Razor could feel the weight of his own past pushing against him, the memories of the violence and the loss. He knew that keeping Lily safe wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't just about fixing motorcycles or offering a roof over her head. It was about keeping her from the same kind of pain that had scarred him. Just then, the sound of a motorcycle engine roared to life outside. Razor froze, his hand instinctively moving toward the knife at his waist. Lily looked up, noticing the change in his posture. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with concern. Razor didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved toward the window, peeking through the blinds. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the familiar colors of his club's bikes parked outside. The club had come. He could feel the tension rising in his chest, his protective instincts kicking in. These were his brothers, but he wasn't sure if it was a good thing that they were here. Razor's brothers had always been a part of his life, but he had started to see things differently. His connection to the club, the loyalty that had once defined him, was starting to feel like a chain rather than a bond. And now, with Lily in his life, everything felt more complicated. "It's nothing," Razor said finally, turning back to Lily. "Just a few old friends." But Lily didn't look convinced. She had noticed the change in him, the way his whole demeanor shifted. "Do you trust them?" she asked quietly, her voice so soft that Razor almost didn't hear her. He met her gaze, his throat tightening. "I trust them to protect us," he said, his voice low measured. "But you're different. I'm going to keep you safe, no matter what it takes." Lily nodded, but her eyes told another story. Razor knew that something had shifted between them in that moment. She had seen through him, seen the vulnerability that he thought he had hidden so well. It was strange, this feeling of being connected to someone again, of having someone depend on him. And even though it scared him, Razor couldn't shake the feeling that protecting Lily was the one thing that truly mattered now. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and quiet moments. Razor kept his distance, his mind constantly on edge, the lingering presence of his club outside the garage reminding him that his life was never as simple as he wished it could be. Lily, on the other hand, seemed to adjust to the rhythm of Razor's world with surprising ease. She spent most of her time in the garage, either helping with the bikes or sitting quietly, her head filled with thoughts he couldn't even begin to imagine. Razor had been used to working alone, but something about having her around made everything feel different, almost like there was a purpose to the work again. Razor hadn't told her much about his past, and he wasn't sure if he ever would. But when she asked him one afternoon, in a rare moment of vulnerability, what had happened to his family, he didn't hesitate. "They're gone," Razor said simply, wiping his hands on a rag as he leaned against the workbench. "I lost them a long time ago." Lily didn't ask for details. She didn't push him, and that was enough for Razor. For once, he didn't feel like he had to explain himself. They sat in silence, the hum of the garage filling the space between them. But then, the sound of a motorcycle approaching broke the stillness. Razor's eyes snapped to the door, his body tense. He didn't need to look to know who it was. His brothers had arrived. The heavy rumble of their engines reverberated through the walls, and Razor could feel the weight of their presence before the door even opened. Steele was the first to step inside, his tall frame casting a shadow as he glanced around the garage. "You good, Razor?" he asked, his voice low and direct, always the first to get to the point. Razor nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife tucked into his belt. "Yeah, we're fine. Just keeping busy." Steele's eyes flicked over to Lily, who was sitting on the edge of the bench, her eyes locked on the bike Razor had been working on. Razor could feel the tension rise in the room, but Steele didn't say anything. He never did when it came to Lily. They both knew the risks of getting involved with anyone outside the club, especially someone so young. "You're not staying out here, are you?" Viper's voice cut through the silence, sharp and impatient. Razor looked at him, his expression hardening. "What's it to you?" he asked, his tone matching Viper's. "She's safe here," Razor added, his voice low but firm. Viper seemed to hesitate for a moment, his gaze shifting from Razor to Lily, and then back again. Finally, he grunted and turned toward the door. "Just don't forget who you're dealing with, Razor," he muttered, his words barely a whisper before he left. Steele lingered for a moment longer, his eyes never leaving Razor. "You know where we stand," he said, and Razor nodded. "I know." The door slammed shut behind them, and Razor was left standing there, the weight of his brother's words hanging in the air. He knew what they meant. He knew the risks of having Lily in his life, of letting her get too close. But the idea of sending her away, leaving her to fend for herself, was something he couldn't even begin to consider. He had promised to protect her, and no matter what, he would keep that promise. That night, after the garage had quieted down, Razor found himself standing in front of the window, looking out at the night sky. The stars were barely visible, hidden behind the haze of city lights and the creeping fog rolling in from the hills. He hadn't been able to sleep, his thoughts restless and tangled. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something bigger than he was ready for. And yet, he couldn't turn away. He couldn't leave Lily to face whatever was coming on her own. He wasn't sure when it happened, when he had shifted from the hardened biker who cared only for the club to the protector of a young girl. But here he was, torn between two worlds. A sudden noise behind him snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned to find Lily standing in the doorway, her small figure barely visible in the dim light. She had been watching him for a while, he realized. "You okay?" she asked quietly, her voice soft but full of concern. Razor didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to her, his boots heavy on the concrete floor. He crouched down to her level, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm fine," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "Just thinking." Lily studied him for a moment, her gaze searching, before she spoke again. "You don't have to protect me, you know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Razor's heart skipped a beat at her words. "I'm not doing it because I have to," he said, his voice rough. "I'm doing it because I want to." She looked at him, her eyes wide, and for the first time since he met her, Razor saw the full weight of her fear, her past, her pain. It was there, hidden behind her calm demeanor, but it was real. Razor reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice steady, firm. "You're safe here." Lily didn't say anything, but the way she looked at him, the way she held his gaze, told him everything he needed to know. In that moment, Razor understood. He had a new purpose now, and no matter what happened, he would protect Lily, no matter the cost. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. Razor couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something big that would change everything. The quiet in the garage, the hum of the bikes, and the steady rhythm of his routine, it all felt like a temporary calm before a storm. But Lily had been adjusting well, surprising him with her resilience. She spent her days helping him with the bikes, learning quickly, asking questions, and soaking in everything he showed her. In those moments, he began to see a different side of her, stronger, braver than most adults he knew. He could see the spark in her eyes, the same one he used to have before the world crushed it. But at night, when they were alone, Razor could still see the remnants of fear in her. She had come from a place of darkness, and while she trusted him, there were still walls around her heart. It was that same fear that had started creeping back into Razor's mind. He knew the peace they had wouldn't last forever. He could feel it in his bones. One late evening, as he worked on the engine of an old bike, he heard a car pull into the driveway. The headlights illuminated the garage, cutting through the dark like a warning. Razor's instincts flared. He turned to see Lily standing in the doorway, her face pale. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Razor didn't answer immediately. He knew who it was. The black sedan parked outside was a sign he couldn't ignore. Steele and Viper, his brothers from the club, had arrived. But this wasn't a friendly visit. Razor could feel the weight of their arrival pressing on his chest. "Stay inside," he told Lily, his voice low. "I'll handle this." She nodded, but Razor could see the uncertainty in her eyes. He didn't want her involved in whatever was coming next. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew that with every passing day, his world was getting more complicated. Razor walked toward the door, his boots heavy against the concrete floor. Steele and Viper were already inside, standing by the workbench. The tension was palpable. "Razor," Steele said, his voice gruff, his eyes hard. "We need to talk." Razor didn't say anything, just watched his brothers carefully. He knew this wasn't just a casual visit. There was something urgent, something dangerous in the air. "I know what this is about," Razor said, his voice low. "You don't need to say it." Steele gave him a sharp look. "You're not fooling anyone, Razor. We know you've been getting soft." "That girl," he trailed off, his voice heavy with accusation. "She's not your responsibility." Razor's heart skipped a beat at the mention of Lily. He'd expected this, but hearing it from Steele made it sting even more. "I don't care what you think," Razor said, his voice growing firm. "She's under my protection. That's all that matters." Viper stepped forward, his eyes narrowed. "You know the rules, Razor. The club comes first. You're risking everything for her. What happens when the club finds out? What happens when they come for her?" Razor's fists clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm not worried about the club," he said, his tone cold. "I'm worried about her." There was a long silence between them. Steele studied Razor for a moment, as if weighing his words. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer this time. "We can't ignore this. The club's got eyes on you. On her. You need to make a choice, Razor. The girl or the club." Razor felt the weight of those words crash over him. He had always known the club would come before everything else, but now, standing here with Lily's safety on the line, the truth hit him like a freight train. He could feel the pull between the two worlds, the world of loyalty, blood, and brotherhood, and the world of protection, care, and hope that he had built with Lily. "I've made my choice," Razor said quietly, his voice unwavering. "And it's her." Steele and Viper exchanged a look, but neither of them spoke. Razor knew they didn't understand. They couldn't. The club had always been everything to them. But Razor had seen enough, lived enough to know that the life he had built with Lily was worth more than any loyalty to the club. The room was still, and for a moment, no one moved. Finally, Steele sighed. "You know what this means, don't you?" Razor nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "Yeah, I do." Steele and Viper turned toward the door, their boots echoing as they walked out. "You're making a mistake," Viper said over his shoulder, his tone full of warning. Razor didn't respond. As the door slammed shut behind them, Razor felt the weight of the decision settle on his shoulders. He knew what was at stake, but it didn't matter. Lily was worth everything. Razor walked back to the workbench, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the wrench. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was a fragile hope, one that could easily be shattered, but it was enough to keep him going. And for Lily, he would fight for that hope. He would protect her, no matter what. The tension Razor had felt since his conversation with Steele and Viper hung thick in the air. It wasn't just the club's presence that weighed on him. It was the knowledge that the life he'd chosen for Lily was now directly at odds with everything he had ever known. He had made his decision. His loyalty was no longer to the club, it was to her. But as he looked at the darkened sky outside the garage, Razor couldn't shake the feeling that this choice would cost him more than he could imagine. The days grew longer, and Razor spent more time keeping watch over the garage, never letting his guard down. Lily was safer now, but even in the comfort of his protective walls, something loomed on the horizon. Razor didn't know how long they had before the club would come looking for him, before the consequences of his choice would catch up with them both. One afternoon, Razor was busy fixing a busted headlight on the motorcycle when he heard the sharp screech of tires outside the garage. His heart raced, and before he even looked out the window, he knew. It was them. Steele and Viper had come back. But this time, it wasn't just the two of them. Razor stood motionless as he heard the unmistakable sound of the club's bikes idling outside. There were more of them this time. Razor's fingers gripped the wrench tightly, his mind racing. He couldn't back down now. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. He turned to Lily, who was sitting in the corner, quietly reading a book. She looked up at him when she noticed the change in his demeanor. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice calm but tinged with worry. Razor gave her a reassuring smile, though the tension in his chest betrayed him. "Just stay inside, Lily," said, his voice steady but firm. "Don't worry. I'll handle this." He turned toward the door, his hand on the knife at his belt, the familiar weight of it grounding him. Razor stepped outside to meet the growing storm that had come knocking on his door. The club was here. The brothers had arrived in full force. The familiar faces of Steele, Viper, and a few others were gathered around, their bikes lined up in a tense formation. Razor's eyes locked on Steele's as he approached. Steele's expression was unreadable, but the anger was evident in the tension of his jaw and the stiffness of his posture. "You've made a hell of a choice, Razor," Steele said, his voice low, but sharp with reproach. "You've turned your back on everything we built. You know the rules. The club comes first." Razor stood his ground, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths. He wasn't going to back down, not now, not after everything he had already sacrificed. "I know what I've done," Razor said, his voice firm, but quiet. "But this is bigger than the club. This is bigger than you or me." Steele's eyes darkened. "You're making a mistake. The club is family, and you're leaving that for some kid who has no place in this world." Razor's jaw clenched, his hands tightening into fists. "She has a place with me," he said, his voice steady, almost too calm. "And I'm not going to let you take her from me." Steele's gaze flickered with frustration, his hands balling into fists as well. "You think you're a hero, Razor? You think this little girl is worth throwing everything away for? The club won't stand for this." "Then I'll stand alone," Razor replied, his voice cold as ice. He stepped forward, locking eyes with his brother, and his voice dropped to a near whisper. "I've already made my choice." There was a tense silence before Steele let out a low, frustrated sigh. "You're a damn fool." Razor didn't answer. Instead, he turned on his heel, heading back toward the garage. He knew the consequences. The club had always been everything to him, but now, for the first time, he saw it for what it really was. A chain, dragging him down. A chain he was willing to break. As Razor reached the door, he heard the sound of boots following him, but he didn't look back. "You know what's coming," Steele called out, his voice grating with frustration. Razor didn't reply, only stepped into the garage and closed the door behind him. His heart was pounding, the reality of the situation settling in. This was it. He had made his decision, and now, the club would be after him. It wasn't just the bikers anymore. It was everything he had known. As he stood in the garage, he looked over at Lily, who had watched the confrontation through the window. Her eyes were wide, full of concern, but also something else. Trust. She trusted him, and that was enough. Razor walked over to her, his footsteps heavy with the weight of what was to come. "They're gone," Razor said softly, trying to reassure her, though his own voice betrayed him. "But we need to be ready. They won't stop until they get what they want." Lily stood up from the chair, her face a mixture of worry and determination. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady, as if she had already accepted the reality of their situation. Razor took a deep breath. "We fight," he said, his voice resolute. "We fight for our safety, for our lives. No matter what happens, we won't back down." He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, looking into her eyes. "We'll face it together, Lily. I won't let anyone take you from me." The days that followed were filled with an overwhelming sense of urgency. Razor could feel the weight of the decision he had made pressing down on him, heavier with each passing minute. His promise to protect Lily had set them on a dangerous path, and he knew the club wouldn't let him walk away so easily. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the knowledge that sooner or later, the club would come knocking. And when they did, Razor wasn't sure how far he was willing to go to keep Lily safe. It was late one night when the phone rang. Razor was working on the engine of an old bike, his hands slick with grease, when the sound cut through the stillness of the garage. He wiped his hands on a rag before answering, his voice low and cautious. "Razor," a voice on the other end said, sharp and urgent. It was Steele. "We need to talk." Razor's stomach sank. He knew what this was about. "I'm not interested in talking," he replied, his voice steady but full of resolve. "You've made your choice," Steele said, his tone colder now. "And you've put the kid in danger." Razor's jaw tightened. "You can't just walk away from the club, Razor. There's no going back." Razor's grip on the phone tightened. "I'm not walking away," he said, his voice firm. "I'm doing what I need to do to keep her safe. And if you can't respect that, then we're done." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Steele spoke again, his voice lower now. "You don't get it, do you?" Steele's words were slow, measured. "The club doesn't forget. And you're making an enemy of everyone you've ever called a brother." Razor's heart pounded, the weight of Steele's words sinking deep. He had known this would happen. He had known that the moment he chose Lily, he was severing ties with the only family he had ever known. The silence stretched on between them, Razor's mind racing with the consequences of his decision. Finally, Steele's voice broke through the quiet. "You've made your bed, Razor. And now you'll lie in it. Don't think for a second that the club won't come for you. We'll be coming for her, too." Razor's breath hitched in his chest, and for a moment, the room seemed to close in on him. He could hear Lily's voice in the back of his mind, reminding him of everything he had promised her. He couldn't back down. "Not now." "You won't touch her," Razor said, his voice colder than it had ever been. "If you come for her, you'll have to go through me." Steele's laugh on the other end was cold, empty. "So be it," he said, before hanging up the phone. Razor stood there, staring at the phone in his hand, his mind spinning with the weight of what he had just heard. They were coming. It was inevitable. The club would stop at nothing to reclaim him, to take Lily away from him. He wasn't sure how much time they had before the storm hit, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let it happen. He couldn't let Lily fall into the hands of the club, not after everything they had been through. Razor turned toward the workbench, his eyes scanning the tools laid out in front of him. It felt like everything was falling apart. But he couldn't afford to lose focus now. He needed to be strong, for her. He knew what was coming, and he had to be ready. Later that night, as the sound of distant motorcycles echoed through the air, Razor felt a strange calm wash over him. He had spent his entire life on the edge, always ready for the next fight, always anticipating the next blow. But this was different. This wasn't just about survival. This was about protecting the one thing that mattered to him. Razor had always been a warrior, a man who lived by a code. But now, that code was being tested in ways he hadn't imagined. As the motorcycles drew closer, Razor turned to find Lily standing in the doorway of the garage, her face pale with worry. She had been quiet all evening, but the look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She knew something was wrong. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with concern. Razor took a deep breath, his mind racing. "It's them," he said, his voice low. "The club's here." Lily didn't flinch. She didn't ask questions. She just looked at him, her eyes filled with quiet strength. "We'll face it together," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. Razor nodded, a sense of gratitude swelling inside him. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She trusted him, and that trust made all the difference. Together, Razor agreed, his voice resolute. As the rumble of the motorcycles grew louder, Razor stood tall, his mind focused on one thing: keeping Lily safe. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that no matter what, he would fight for her, and he would never back down. The sound of the motorcycles outside grew louder, reverberating through the walls of the garage. Razor could feel his pulse quicken as he moved to the door, his instincts kicking in. He knew what was coming. His brothers from the club had arrived, and it wasn't going to be a peaceful visit. He glanced at Lily, who stood at the back of the garage, her face a mixture of concern and determination. She had been through too much already, and Razor wasn't about to let her go through any more. But he could see the strength in her eyes now, the same strength that had surprised him in those early days when she showed no fear. She trusted him. She trusted him to keep her safe, and Razor would do everything in his power to honor that trust. He walked toward the door, his hand brushing against the cold steel of the frame as he prepared himself. He could hear the motorcycles pull to a stop outside, the sound of boots hitting the pavement. The club was here. Razor could sense the tension building. He wasn't sure how this was going to play out, but he knew one thing for sure. He was done running. He stepped outside, the cool night air biting at his skin as the door creaked open. The shadows of his brothers stood in front of him, tall and imposing, their faces hard and unreadable. Steel and Viper were the first to approach, their eyes locked on Razor. "Razor," Steel said, his voice gruff, "you've made a big mistake." Razor didn't flinch. He had heard those words before. He had always known that the moment he made his choice, the club would come for him. "I'm not backing down," Razor said, his voice steady. "Not this time." Steel's jaw tightened, and Viper stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're not just putting yourself in danger, Razor," Viper said, his tone low and dangerous. "You're putting her in danger too." Razor turned his gaze to Lily, who stood just inside the doorway, watching him with wide eyes. "She's not your concern," Razor said, his voice cold. "I'm the one you're dealing with." Steel stepped closer, his boots scraping against the ground. "You're not going to get away with this, Razor," he said, his words a warning. Razor knew exactly what that meant. The club had never been one to let betrayal slide. But he wasn't afraid. He had already made his choice. "I've already made my decision," Razor said, his voice firm. "I'm not going back to the club." Steel stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to gauge whether Razor was bluffing. Finally, he spoke, his words laced with frustration. "You're making a mistake, Razor. You're leaving everything behind for a little girl. What happens when the club comes for you? What happens when we show up at her door?" Razor's heart tightened at the thought. He had already known the consequences of his actions. He had known that the club would come for him, that there would be no peace, no escape. But he was willing to face that. "For Lily, I'll handle it," Razor said, his voice low but full of determination. "I won't let anything happen to her." Steel and Viper exchanged a glance, their faces hardening. "You think you're the only one who's sacrificed for this club?" Viper asked, his voice dripping with disdain. Razor's eyes flashed with anger. "I'm not your problem anymore," he said, his voice like steel. "But she is. She's under my protection, and if you think you can touch her, you'll have to go through me." The silence stretched between them, the weight of Razor's words settling in the air. Steel's eyes flicked to Viper, then back to Razor. Finally, Steel spoke, his voice low and harsh. "You've made your bed, Razor," he said. "Now you'll lie in it. The club doesn't forget." Razor stood his ground, his fists clenched at his sides. "I'm not afraid of you," he said quietly. "You're not my family anymore. She is." Steel took a step back, his eyes narrowing. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "This isn't over." Razor didn't respond. He didn't need to. The club had made its choice, and so had he. He turned and walked back into the garage, his shoulders square, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. Lily was waiting for him, her eyes filled with questions he didn't have the answers to. But one thing he knew for sure, he wasn't going to let anything happen to her. "It's going to be okay," he said, his voice rough as he walked toward her. She looked up at him, her gaze steady, and for the first time, Razor saw the trust in her eyes. She wasn't afraid. "Not anymore." "I believe you," she whispered. Razor took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing. He would fight for her, no matter the cost. He had already lost so much, but he wasn't going to lose her. Not like this. Razor stood tall, his gaze shifting toward the door, knowing that the storm was coming. And when it did, he would be ready. The night was still, but Razor could feel the storm coming. His decision to stand against the club had already cost him more than he could count, but the weight of it all didn't hit him until he saw the look on Lily's face. She was still young, still full of hope, but there was a hardness in her eyes now. Something had changed in both of them. The quiet that followed Steel and Viper's departure felt like a brief reprieve before the inevitable. Razor sat on the bench, staring at the tools scattered across the workbench. He had fixed bikes for years, But never had he faced a repair job like this. No amount of wrenching or turning would fix what was about to come. The club was coming, and Razor was ready to face whatever they threw at him. But for Lily's sake, he had to be smart. Razor's thoughts were interrupted by a light knock at the door. He tensed, expecting it to be another visit from the club, but when he opened it, he saw no one but Lily standing there. She didn't say anything at first, just looked up at him with those big eyes that always seemed to see right through him. "What now?" she finally asked, her voice steady, but there was a hint of fear in it. Razor exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. "Now we wait," he said. "They're not going to stop, but neither am I." Lily nodded slowly, taking a step forward. "You're not going to let them hurt me, are you?" Her voice trembled slightly, despite the strength she tried to project. Razor crouched down in front of her, placing his hands on her shoulders. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said firmly. "I promise you." She looked up at him, searching his face, trying to find the reassurance she so desperately needed. "I believe you," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of trust and fear. Razor's heart twisted. He had promised to protect her, but he didn't know if he was strong enough to keep that promise. The club was ruthless, and once they set their sights on something, they didn't stop until they got it. Razor knew that better than anyone. The quiet stretched on, the seconds ticking by as both of them waited for something that would change everything. Just as Razor was about to speak, the sound of a motorcycle engine echoed in the distance. It wasn't the rumble of a single bike, but the collective growl of many. Razor's muscles tensed. He could feel the air shift, thickening with the tension of what was to come. The club was here. They were right outside. Razor stood, his body moving instinctively as he walked toward the door. Lily followed behind him, her steps hesitant but determined. "Stay inside," Razor said, his voice low, almost too calm. But Lily didn't listen. She stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the door, ready to face whatever was coming with him. Razor's heart skipped a beat. She was no longer the scared little girl who had run to him for safety. She had become his strength. He could see it in the way she stood, her shoulders squared, her jaw set. She wasn't going to back down. Neither was he. The motorcycle stopped just outside the door, and Razor's eyes narrowed. He could hear the boots hitting the ground, the sound of men approaching, heavy with purpose. The door opened slowly, and in walked Steele and Viper, followed by a few other members of the club. Razor didn't flinch, but he could feel the heat of their presence. The tension was so thick that it felt like a physical weight. Steele looked around, his eyes scanning the garage, his gaze falling on Lily for a moment before returning to Razor. "I told you," Steele said, his voice cold. "This is bigger than you, Razor. You're putting everyone in danger, including her." Razor stepped forward, his body tense but ready. "I made my choice," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "And I'm not going to back down." Viper stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You think you're the only one who's sacrificed for this club?" he growled. "You think you can just walk away like it doesn't matter?" Razor's heart pounded in his chest. "I'm not walking away," he said quietly, his voice filled with quiet fury. "I'm just choosing to protect what matters now." Steele's eyes flicked over to Lily again, then back to Razor. "You've crossed a line," Steele said, his voice almost a whisper, full of warning. Razor's hand clenched into a fist. "I've crossed no line. I'm doing what needs to be done." He glanced at Lily, standing behind him with her head held high. "And I'm not going to let you take her from me." The silence between them was heavy, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. Steele didn't move, but his eyes burned with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "You've made a mistake, Razor," he said finally, his voice full of venom. "You think you can protect her from everything? From us?" Razor took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving Steele's. "I don't care what you think," he said, his voice low but full of resolve. "She's mine to protect. And I will." Steele stepped back, his expression darkening. "So be it," he muttered. He turned to the others, giving a subtle nod. The club members exchanged a look before slowly backing toward the door. "This isn't over, Razor," Steele said, his words filled with finality. "You've made your choice, and we'll make ours." As the door slammed shut behind them, Razor stood still, his heart racing. The silence that followed felt deafening. But Lily was still there, standing beside him. And for the first time in his life, Razor didn't feel alone. He had made his choice, and he would face whatever came next with Lily by his side. The following days were tense. Razor could feel the weight of the club's threat hanging over him like a storm cloud ready to burst. The sound of their motorcycles still echoed in his mind, and he couldn't shake the image of Steele's eyes, cold and unforgiving, as they left the garage. He knew it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The club had made their position clear, and Razor had made his own. But he was ready for whatever came next. Razor spent the days working on the bikes, his focus sharp, his movements precise. But it was hard to keep his mind on the job. He knew the club wouldn't just let this go. They never did. Lily had become more quiet in the days following the confrontation, her eyes sometimes distant, like she was lost in thoughts that Razor couldn't reach. He had tried to talk to her, to reassure her that everything would be okay, but he knew that she had seen too much, been through too much, to truly believe that things were fine. She had seen the dark side of life, and that side had followed her here. Razor couldn't pretend to offer her a normal life, but he could give her something better than what she had before. The garage had become their safe place, but Razor couldn't ignore the danger that was closing in around them. One afternoon, as he was finishing up some work on a bike, Razor heard the sound of footsteps approaching. He turned to find Lily standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak right away, just stood there, watching him. "You okay?" Razor asked, wiping his hands on a rag. She nodded slowly, then stepped inside, her eyes meeting his. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Razor's heart tightened. "About what?" She hesitated for a moment, then spoke, her words heavy with emotion. "About us. About what happens next." Razor didn't know what to say. He had been thinking about it too, but he hadn't wanted to burden her with the reality of their situation. "I know you're scared," he said, his voice soft. "But I'm not going anywhere. I'll protect you. That's what matters." Lily's gaze softened, but there was still a flicker of worry in her eyes. "But what about them?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "The club. What if they come for us?" Razor walked over to her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice steady, though the weight of his words hit him harder than he had expected. "We'll face it together." She nodded, but Razor could see the fear lingering in her eyes. He knew that she didn't believe him completely, and he couldn't blame her. The club was ruthless, and they had already proven they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Razor had always known this would come down to a fight, but he hadn't expected it to be with his own brothers. The loyalty that had once defined him now felt like a chain, pulling him back to a life he no longer wanted. And yet, he couldn't walk away from it all. The choice had already been made, and he wasn't going to let Lily face this alone. As the days passed, Razor noticed the change in her. She wasn't just the scared little girl anymore. She had become strong, determined. She helped him with the bikes, asking questions and learning quickly. But more than that, she was becoming someone Razor could rely on, someone who wasn't afraid to face the truth. They had spent so much time running, hiding, that it felt like they were finally starting to stand still. But even as they found a sense of calm in the chaos, Razor knew it wouldn't last. The club was still out there, waiting. He could feel their eyes on him, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they came knocking again. Razor couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, something big. It was a strange, heavy feeling that settled in his chest like a warning he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the club anymore. Something darker, something more dangerous was looming. One evening, as Razor was working late into the night, he heard the faint sound of a knock at the door. His heart raced, and he immediately stood up, his senses alert. He was ready for anything. But when he opened the door, it wasn't Steele or Viper standing there. It was someone else. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat and a hat that shaded his face. Razor's hand instinctively went to the knife at his belt, but the man held up his hands, showing he was unarmed. "I'm not here to cause trouble," the man said, his voice low but steady. Razor didn't say anything, just stared at him, his muscles tense. The man took a step closer. "You're Razor, right?" he asked, his eyes scanning Razor's face. Razor didn't respond, but the man continued. "I'm not with the club," he said. "But I know them, and I know they're coming for you." Razor's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just some random visitor. This was someone who knew what was at stake. The man's eyes locked onto Razor's, his gaze hard and knowing. "You need to get out," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now." Razor didn't move. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice tight with suspicion. The man hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. Someone who's been watching the club for a long time. Someone who knows what they're capable of. Razor felt a chill run down his spine. The man's words were heavy, filled with the kind of truth that Razor couldn't ignore. Something was coming, and it wasn't just the club. This man knew something Razor didn't. What do you want from me? Razor asked, his voice low. The man's eyes softened. I want to help you, he said. But you need to trust me. And you need to leave. Now. Razor stood there for a long moment, the weight of the man's words settling over him. He wasn't sure who this man was, but he knew one thing. He couldn't ignore this warning. The storm was coming, and they weren't ready for it. The man standing at the door was no stranger to danger. His presence alone sent a chill through Razor, his instincts screaming that this was the beginning of something much worse. The stranger's words echoed in Razor's mind. The club is coming for you. You need to leave. Now. Razor stood frozen for a moment, studying the man. He could feel the weight of his past decisions pressing on him. He had made his choice, to protect Lily, to step away from the club, but the consequences were now crashing down like a freight train. He couldn't ignore the man's warning, not after everything that had happened. Who are you? Razor asked again, his voice steady but filled with suspicion. The stranger looked over his shoulder, as if to check if anyone was following him, then leaned in closer. That's not important right now, the man replied, his voice low and urgent. What matters is that you get out of here before they show up. Razor's mind raced. The club was close. He could feel it. But he couldn't just leave Lily behind. She was too important. Razor turned his head toward the garage where Lily had been working on a bike. She was still inside, unaware of the danger creeping closer. I can't just leave her, Razor said, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's eyes softened, but only slightly. You think the club is going to care about her? They don't care who gets hurt. They'll take her if they have to. Razor. You know how they work. Razor clenched his fists, the weight of those words sinking in. He wasn't sure who this man was, or why he was helping, but he knew the threat was real. Steel and Viper had made it clear that Razor had betrayed them, and if the club wasn't going to stop at anything to get him back, then Lily was in just as much danger as he was. I can't leave without her, Razor repeated, his jaw tight with determination. The man sighed, frustration creeping into his features. Listen to me, he said, his voice hard. You don't have much time. The club's tracking you. If you stay here, you'll both be dead by morning. I can help you get out, but you need to trust me. Razor didn't answer right away. He had never been good at trusting people, especially strangers. But this man knew too much. He knew about the club. He knew about the danger. Razor's eyes flicked toward the door leading into the garage, his heart pounding. He had to act fast. All right, Razor said, his voice sharp with resolve. But if anything happens to her, it's on you. The man nodded, his face serious. Understood. Without another word, he turned and started walking toward the back of the garage, signaling for Razor to follow. Razor glanced back at the garage door where Lily was working, her back turned. He didn't want to leave her, but he knew it was the only choice they had. They needed to move before it was too late. Razor followed the man through the back alley behind the garage. It was dark, the streetlights flickering as a cold wind cut through the narrow passage. The man led Razor to a car parked down the street, its engine running. Razor hesitated for a moment before getting inside. He had no idea where they were going, but he had no other choice. The stranger drove quickly, his hands gripping the wheel tightly, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror. Razor kept his eyes on the road ahead, his mind racing with thoughts of Lily. She was still back at the garage, unaware of the danger closing in. Razor's heart twisted in his chest. He had promised to protect her, but now he was running, leaving her behind. He couldn't do that. He wouldn't. We're almost there, the man said, breaking the silence. Razor's eyes snapped to him. Where? It's a safe house. A place where you can lay low until things settle down. The man explained, his voice calm. It's not perfect, but it's the best we can do for now. Razor nodded, but the unease in his chest only grew stronger. He needed to get Lily, to make sure she was safe. The stranger glanced over at him. Don't worry. You'll be able to get to her soon. Just keep your head down for now. The club's still looking for you, but if you're smart, they won't find you. Razor didn't respond. He couldn't think about anything else but getting back to the garage, getting Lily. As the car sped through the streets, Razor's mind raced with possibilities. He had to get her out. The club wouldn't stop until they had her, until they had him. But Razor couldn't let them have either of them. The car came to a sudden stop, and the man turned off the engine. "We're here," he said, his voice firm. Razor didn't hesitate. He opened the door and stepped out, his body tense, his eyes scanning the area. The safe house was a small building on the outskirts of town, isolated and quiet. Razor followed the man inside, his senses heightened. The place was empty, except for a few pieces of old furniture. It was far from ideal, but it would have to do. Razor's eyes scanned the room, and his mind kept returning to Lily. He had to get back to her, to protect her. The stranger stood by the door, watching him closely. "You need to stay here for now," the man said, his voice low. "I'll be back with more information. Just stay hidden, and don't trust anyone." Razor nodded, his jaw clenched. "I'll be ready." As the man left, Razor stood in the empty room, his mind focused on one thing: Lily. He couldn't afford to wait. The club was coming for them, and he wasn't going to let them take her. Razor stood alone in the safe house, the silence pressing down on him like a weight. His mind was racing, his thoughts tangled with worry and anger. He had promised Lily safety, promised that he would always protect her, but now she was still back at the garage, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The man who had brought him here had left just moments ago, and Razor had no choice but to wait. The walls of the small, isolated building seemed to close in around him. He could still hear the sound of the motorcycles, the faint memory of the club's growls in the back of his mind. They were coming for him, for them, and Razor had no illusions about how far the club would go to get what they wanted. His hand tightened around the knife tucked into his belt, the cold steel grounding him in the reality of what he was up against. Razor had always known that the life of a biker wasn't an easy one, but he had never expected it to come to this. He had walked away from the club, broken their rules, and now they wanted him back. And worse, they would stop at nothing to hurt Lily to get to him. The thought of her in danger, the idea that she could be hurt because of him, made Razor's blood boil. He had sworn to protect her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what he did, the club would find a way to tear them apart. Razor paced the small room, trying to think of his next move. His mind kept going back to Lily. He needed to get back to her, but he couldn't risk leading the club straight to her. They had to be careful, strategic. Time was running out. Razor's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching outside. His heart skipped a beat, his body tensing instinctively. He moved to the window, careful not to make a sound. He peered through the cracks in the blinds, his breath steady as he watched the figure approaching. It was the stranger. Razor had no idea who this man was, but he had been the only one who had warned him about the club's movements. Razor didn't trust him completely, but he didn't have many options. He had to find out what the man knew. Razor opened the door as the man reached it. "You need to get moving," the stranger said, his voice urgent, his eyes scanning the street behind him. "They're close. The club's on your tail, and they won't stop until they find you." Razor's pulse quickened. "What about Lily?" he asked, his voice low. "She's still back at the garage." The man paused, then glanced at Razor, his face hardening. "You can't go back there now. It's too risky. They'll be watching." Razor's jaw tightened. "I'm not leaving her behind." The stranger stepped closer, his expression serious. "I get it, but you don't have a choice. The club is too close. If you don't leave now, they'll find you both. And when they do, it won't be pretty." Razor's mind raced, torn between his promise to Lily and the reality of their situation. He couldn't risk her safety by going back, but he couldn't just leave her either. "I'll protect her," Razor said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "I'll find a way." The stranger didn't respond right away. He simply stared at Razor for a moment, as if weighing the truth of his words. Then, with a resigned sigh, he spoke again. "The only way to keep her safe is to get out. You need to move, Razor. Fast." Razor clenched his fists. He knew the stranger was right. The club was coming for them, and they couldn't stay here. They couldn't stay anywhere the club might think to look. "Fine," Razor said, his voice grim. "But we're not going far. I'm not leaving her behind." The man's gaze softened, but only slightly. "I didn't say you had to leave her. But you can't go back. Not yet. Let me help you." Razor didn't have the luxury of time to argue. He needed a plan, and if this man could help, he would take whatever help he could get. "Where are we going?" Razor asked, his tone demanding an answer. The man didn't hesitate. "I've got a place. It's off the radar. You'll be safe there, at least for a while. But you need to trust me. Razor didn't like trusting anyone, but at this point, it was his only option. Let's go, he said, the urgency in his voice clear. The stranger nodded, leading the way as Razor followed him out of the safe house. The streets were eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional gust of wind rustling through the trees. Razor kept his eyes on the stranger, his mind running through the worst-case scenarios. He wasn't sure he could trust this man, but right now, trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. They drove through the quiet streets, Razor's mind never far from Lily. Every second felt like an eternity, every shadow hiding potential danger. Razor needed to get back to her, to make sure she was safe. But every mile they drove took him further from the place he had promised to protect. He couldn't keep her safe if he wasn't there. Razor's thoughts were interrupted as the stranger made a sudden turn, driving down an even quieter road. The man glanced over at him. You'll be safe here. Just lay low, don't make a sound. We'll figure this out. Razor wasn't convinced, but at least they were off the main roads. He would take the man's advice, for now. As the car rolled to a stop, Razor's thoughts were already back on Lily, knowing that he had to find a way to keep her out of harm's reach. The storm was coming, and he wasn't sure if they would survive it. The night was quieter than usual, but the tension in Razor's chest was anything but calm. He had been driving for what felt like hours, the car weaving through the dark streets as the stranger, still mostly silent, guided him through unfamiliar roads. Every corner Razor turned, every street they passed, his mind kept returning to Lily. Was she safe? Was she still at the garage alone? Razor's grip tightened on the seat. He had promised to protect her. And yet, he was here, miles away from the one person who needed him most. The club was out there, and they wouldn't stop until they got him back. He knew that better than anyone. The stranger finally pulled the car into an old, secluded property at the edge of town, the lights of the city barely visible in the distance. Razor didn't ask any questions as the man led him into a small house hidden behind overgrown trees. The place was run down but safe, far enough from the main roads that it would be hard for anyone to find them. Razor barely looked around before turning to face the stranger. What's the plan? He asked, his voice rough with the stress of the situation. You stay here, lay low, the man said, glancing at Razor, then back at the road. We'll figure things out tomorrow. It's too dangerous to do anything tonight. Razor didn't argue. He had no other choice but to follow the stranger's lead. As much as it hurt to be away from Lily, he knew he couldn't help her if he was dead. Razor sat on the couch in the small, dimly lit room, his mind racing. How could he keep her safe? How could he keep them both safe when the world around them was so full of danger? The house was quiet except for the distant hum of a generator, the kind of sound that made Razor feel like he was in hiding, even though he knew it was for their own protection. His thoughts shifted back to Lily. He hated the idea of her alone, even though he had tried his best to shield her from the harsh realities of their lives. She was too young for all of this, too innocent. But Razor knew that in this world, innocence didn't last long. That thought twisted his gut. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and Razor pulled it out quickly. The screen was cracked, but he could still make out the message. A number he didn't recognize. Are you safe? The text read. Razor stared at the message, the words cutting through the fog in his brain. Someone knew where he was. He didn't hesitate. He dialed the number back, his heart pounding in his chest. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. You're not safe, the voice said, its tone urgent. The club knows where you are. They're coming. Razor's blood ran cold. He had no idea how they had found him, but he didn't have time to question it. How long do I have? Razor asked, his voice steady despite the rising panic in his chest. Maybe an hour, the man on the other end said. Maybe less. You need to move. Now. Razor didn't wait for another word. He slammed the phone down and rushed to the door. He knew the stranger wouldn't be happy with him, but there was no time to waste. He needed to get back to the garage. He needed to get to Lily. Razor grabbed his jacket and ran to the car, his heart thundering in his chest. He could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him. He had left her behind once, but he couldn't do it again. He wouldn't. As the engine roared to life, Razor's mind raced. The club was coming. They were getting closer. But this time, Razor wasn't going to wait for them to come to him. This time, he was going to take the fight to them. Razor's hand gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, but his thoughts kept returning to Lily. The club was ruthless, but Razor was no stranger to fighting. He had spent years in the club, fighting for what he believed in, fighting for loyalty. But this fight wasn't about loyalty anymore. It was about protecting her. Razor didn't care what happened to him, but he would die before he let the club take her. The city lights flickered in the distance, and Razor's foot pressed harder on the gas. He had no time to waste. The stranger had warned him, and now he had to make his move. The club would be looking for him, but they wouldn't know where he was going. Razor's plan was simple: get back to the garage, get Lily, and get out. He wasn't going to let the club destroy everything he had fought for. Razor's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but there was one thing he was sure of. He would protect Lily at all costs. His phone buzzed again, but he didn't answer it. There was no time for distractions. He needed to focus. As he turned onto the road that led to the garage, Razor saw the faint outline of a figure in the distance. A silhouette, standing in the shadows. It was Lily. Razor's heart skipped a beat. He slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt in front of her. She looked up at him, her face pale but determined. "I knew you'd come back," she said, her voice shaking slightly. Razor stepped out of the car, rushing to her side. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The weight of the situation was clear in her eyes. "We need to go," Razor said, his voice low and urgent. "Now." Lily nodded, and together they moved quickly toward the car. Razor's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced over his shoulder. The club was coming. But for the first time in a long time, Razor felt like he was fighting for something worth saving.